There's a clip floating around this week that Browns fans need to actually sit with before we get into anything else, because it reframes everything about this quarterback situation. Chad Johnson, the guy everybody knows as Ocho, was on a podcast talking through the Shedeur Sanders situation with a co-host, and the tone of that entire conversation wasn't sympathy, it was certainty. Ocho kept coming back to one idea: Sanders' opportunity isn't a maybe. It's coming. Not someday, not eventually if things break right, but soon, like it's already written and just waiting on the calendar to catch up. Let me walk you through why that clip matters more than a random podcast take usually would. Ocho didn't start his own rookie year in this league. He sat behind Darnay Scott, Ron Dugans, and Peter Warrick before he ever became the version of himself everybody remembers. His co-host on that show, a former NBA player, told a nearly identical story from a completely different sport. Drafted at 21, stuck behind a loaded veteran rotation, playing so tight and so aware of who was sitting at the scorer's table ready to sub him out that he couldn't actually play his game. He said the turning point wasn't better practice habits or a coaching adjustment. It was simply getting moved past those veterans entirely, at which point the game finally slowed down and he started playing free instead of playing scared. That's the exact word that got used to describe what these two are watching happen with Deshaun Watson right now. Scared. Not as an official Browns statement, to be clear. Just their read as two guys who've lived through exactly this kind of pressure themselves. But listen to the reasoning behind it, because it's not just vibes. When a player is worried about the mistake, instead of the throw, everything changes. You stop playing the game in front of you and start playing defense against your own bench. That's what they were describing when they said Watson's confidence looks shot right now. Whether or not that's fully accurate, it's exactly the kind of read that comes from people who've actually lived on that side of a depth chart, not from a fan with a strong opinion and a Twitter account. I think it's worth explaining why that particular diagnosis carries more weight than the usual outside noise a quarterback deals with in a moment like this. Neither of these guys is a professional football analyst getting paid to break down tape for a living. They're former athletes describing a psychological state they recognize because they've personally been trapped inside of it. That's a different kind of credibility than a stat sheet or a grade from a scouting service. Fear, in a competitive setting, doesn't always show up as an obvious mistake on film. Sometimes it shows up as hesitation nobody outside the building can quite name. A half second of extra thought before releasing a throw that used to come out clean. A check down that wasn't really necessary but felt safer in the moment. If that's genuinely what's happening with Watson right now, it's not something a game plan alone fixes. It's something that only gets solved by him actually going out and stringing together good football, rep after rep, until the hesitation fades on its own. There's also real history behind why a two-time Achilles tear survivor might be dealing with exactly this kind of internal battle right now, separate from anything to do with talent or preparation. Coming back from one major injury is hard enough on a player's mind. Coming back from the same injury twice, on both sides of his body, is a completely different psychological mountain to climb, and it would be unusual if that history wasn't sitting somewhere in the back of his head every time he plants his foot to throw. None of that excuses poor play if it shows up on Sundays, but it does add real context to why two people who've walked through their own versions of this exact struggle are the ones raising the flag first. So here's the official version, because we should get it on the table clearly before going further. Todd Monken made his call. Watson opens the season as the starter against Jacksonville. Monken's explanation was that he looked at the complete picture, not one practice or one preseason snap, but the whole stretch, from off-season work, through training camp, through joint practices, through every preseason rep. Fair enough on its face. Coaches genuinely do see things the rest of us don't get access to. But here's what changes the moment that decision gets made official. Watson doesn't just have to win the job anymore. He has to keep it, and Sanders' entire job description just shifted with it. Stay locked in. Prepare like he's the starter every single week. Keep learning this offense inside and out, and be ready to kick the door down the second it opens even slightly. I actually want to give real credit to how Sanders reportedly handled getting that news, because it says something about where his head is at. No drama, no public complaining, no noticeable shift in body language once the decision came down. By all accounts, he sat down with his coaching staff, absorbed it, and understood exactly what was being asked of him. That matters more than people give it credit for, because quarterback development was never just about arm talent. It's about maturity under disappointment. It's about how a guy reacts the moment he's told not yet instead of yes. And from what's being described, Sanders' answer to that moment was simple. Fine. I'll keep working. That's precisely the response you want out of a young player sitting in that exact spot. Now, let's get into why this decision looks a lot more complicated once you actually put the preseason numbers next to it. Against Buffalo, Sanders completed 9 of 11 passes for 74 yards, threw a touchdown, and also threw an interception. Watson finished that same game 5 of 12 for 36 yards with an interception of his own. On efficiency alone, that's not a close comparison, that's a gap. Before anyone runs straight to the conclusion that Sanders should be starting out right, remember, Watson opened this preseason against Chicago by completing 11 of 15 passes for 126 yards, a genuinely solid outing in its own right. That's exactly why Monken keeps leaning on the phrase, full body of work, instead of pointing to any single performance. He's not wrong that a complete evaluation should include more than one snapshot. But once the games start actually counting, that framing stops mattering to the guy lined up across from Watson in the other jersey. I also want to be fair to the small sample problem here, because it cuts both directions and it's worth acknowledging honestly. 9 completions on 11 attempts is an excellent rate. But it's still 11 attempts, not a full season's worth of drives against a defense trying to disguise its actual game plan. Preseason opponents are often protecting their own scheme just as much as the team on offense is, which means neither of these performances should get treated as gospel on its own. What makes the Buffalo numbers matter anyway is the pattern they fit into, rather than the raw total by itself. Multiple people who watch this camp closely all season are describing roughly the same thing. A young quarterback who looks comfortable and in rhythm, paired with a veteran quarterback who looks tighter than his experience level should allow. One clean stat line doesn't prove that pattern definitively. But it's one more data point lining up with a story that keeps repeating itself from multiple independent directions. And that's where this gets real. Because Jacksonville isn't walking into Week 1 caring anything about Cleveland's internal evaluation process. They're going to bring real pressure. They're going to test his timing in the pocket immediately. They're going to force him to stand in there, process the read, and rip the football without hesitating. Because hesitation against a defense with real speed off the edge gets quarterbacks hit. And repeated hits are exactly how a shaky confidence turns into a genuinely damaged one. That's the part of this story that should have every Browns fan paying close attention over these next few weeks. Not the depth chart itself, but how Watson actually holds up the first time real pressure shows up on tape instead of a scripted preseason rep. There's a broader pattern across this league worth mentioning here too, because Cleveland isn't the first franchise to face this exact fork in the road. Plenty of teams have handed a difficult early stretch to an established, expensive veteran quarterback, specifically because of the money and years already invested, only to watch that patience get tested hard once the losses start piling up publicly. The counter-argument coaches usually give is stability. That bouncing a locker room between two different starters creates more confusion than it solves. There's truth in that too. But stability only holds up as a defense for so long if the tape keeps saying something different every single week. At some point, the conversation stops being about which quarterback deserves loyalty and starts being about which quarterback actually gives this specific roster the best chance to salvage a season that's already dealing with plenty of other problems. So what does Monken actually need to do here if that concern about hesitation and confidence turns out to be accurate? Get him comfortable early. Feed him easy completions to start, crossing routes, quick screens, shorter timing throws that let him get into rhythm without asking him to erase a deficit by himself. Let him bank some clean, positive plays before putting anything heavier on his plate. This offense does not need Watson trying to single-handedly save every possession. It needs controlled, efficient football, protect the football, move the chains, let the running game and the defense carry some of that weight. And when the opponent finally overextends trying to force something, that's when you let him attack downfield and make them pay for it. Here's the piece of this whole situation that actually leaves me feeling more optimistic about Cleveland's overall position than the panic online might suggest. This roster currently has something a lot of teams around this league would genuinely want, which is a real fallback plan that doesn't require an outside trade or a rushed free agent signing. Watson gets his chance to show he can still be that guy. Behind him sits a young quarterback who looks hungry, sounds composed, and is showing zero interest in manufacturing drama around a decision that didn't go his way. That's not automatically a crisis. Handled correctly by this coaching staff, that's an actual competitive advantage. The kind most rosters simply don't have sitting on their bench in August. Compare that to what a lot of other franchises are dealing with at this exact position around the league right now. Some teams enter the season with a shaky starter and absolutely nothing credible behind him, which means one bad month turns into a full-blown organizational crisis with no internal solution available. Cleveland doesn't have that specific problem, whatever else is going wrong around this roster. If Watson struggles, this isn't a building forced to scramble the waiver wire or gauge interest in a disgruntled veteran on another roster. The answer is already on the practice field, already learning the offense at full speed, already been described by people who watched him up close all summer as ready the moment his number actually gets called. That single fact changes the entire risk profile of this season for Cleveland. Even if it doesn't fully answer the question of who should be starting right now. Think about how that dynamic actually plays out from here. If Watson comes out of the gate and this offense finds any real rhythm, Cleveland wins some early football games, and Sanders gets the far more valuable version of a rookie contract season. Actual development time on a practice field, instead of getting thrown into live fire before he's ready for it. That's the best-case version of this story, and it's a legitimately good outcome for the franchise, regardless of how loud the frustration around this decision has been this week. But if the offense stumbles instead, and there are real reasons circulating right now to think it might, Cleveland isn't stuck scrambling for answers. There's a prepared, sharp young quarterback already sitting in that quarterback room every single day, ready the moment his number actually gets called. That's exactly the message Ocho was sending in that clip, and I think it's worth repeating here because it's the right one. Keep studying, keep preparing like the job's already yours, even when it isn't yet, because opportunities in this league almost never send out an invitation ahead of time. They just arrive. One rough drive, one injury nobody sees coming, one coach turning around mid-series and calling for a helmet, and suddenly an entire building, an entire fan base, is watching one guy step onto that field with zero warning. When that moment lands, and in a league built on unpredictability, it usually does eventually land. The only thing that actually matters is whether the guy standing there is ready for it. I keep coming back to that comparison Ocho's co-host made about his own career, because I think it applies here more directly than it might sound at first. He didn't say the turning point was a growth moment or a breakthrough in practice. He said it was simply removing the pressure of the veterans sitting there, watching, waiting to take his spot back the second he slipped. Once that specific pressure disappeared, his game opened up almost immediately. Sanders doesn't have that exact luxury right now, because the veteran he's competing with isn't getting traded away this week. He's the starter, fully guaranteed, and not going anywhere on the sole basis of one shaky preseason stretch. But the lesson still translates in a different form. The version of Sanders that gets an opportunity eventually, whenever that actually happens, needs to be the version that spent this entire stretch playing loose and confident in practice rather than tight and anxious about proving a point. Based on everything being described about how he's carrying himself right now, that part at least seems to be exactly where it needs to be. So, here's where this leaves us heading into a real regular season. Watson has the job on paper, and Monken's explanation for that decision isn't unreasonable when you actually walk through the entire body of work argument honestly. But the preseason numbers complicate that narrative in a way that's impossible to fully wave away. A former player's honest read on Watson's confidence adds another layer of real concern, and Sanders' calm, professional response to all of it has genuinely impressed people who've lived through this exact situation themselves. None of that guarantees anything about how the next few months actually unfold, and I want to be honest about that, instead of pretending I know exactly how this resolves. Maybe Watson comes out against Jacksonville, plays clean, controlled football, and this entire conversation quiets down within a couple of weeks. That's absolutely still possible, and if it happens, all of this preseason noise gets forgotten fast the way it usually does, once a season actually gets rolling. But if it doesn't happen that way, if the hesitation these two described on that podcast shows up on Sundays the same way it apparently showed up in camp, Cleveland isn't walking into that scenario unprepared the way plenty of other franchises would be. This story is nowhere close to finished. The only real question left is how long Cleveland actually sticks with this plan if the offense stumbles the way some people are already bracing for, and whether the patience being asked of Sanders right now turns out to be a short wait or a very long one.